If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. The Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse resulted in over 30,000 casualties, but by the end, Ulysses S. Grant hadn't been able to destroy Robert E. Lee's army. During the last phase of the battle, Grant had sent Winfield Scott Hancock and his Second Corps away from the battlefield in an attempt to draw Lee away from his entrenchments around the courthouse and to attack Hancock. Grant planned for his other 3 corps to hit Lee out in the open if Lee went for the bait. Lee got word about Hancock's movement and did move Richard Ewell's Second Corps a few miles to the southeast, but hadn't gone after Hancock. Grant now decided to push south by moving Governor K. Warren's 5th Corps in the same direction of Hancock. By this point, Lee could see that Grant was making a wide swing in an attempt to get to Richmond. However, there was a problem. 2 Union corps still faced Lee on the Spotsylvania battlefield. If Lee attempted to move south, Grant could attack his spread-out army. Lee could breathe a little easy because Richmond sent some forces north. Troops under John C. Breckinridge, fresh off their victory at the Battle of Newmarket in the Shenandoah Valley, as well as George Pickett's division, guarded the way across the North Anna River near Hanover Station. Now, Grant worried that with his army spread out, Lee could defeat him in detail. He would later write that Lee would never again have such an opportunity of dealing a heavy blow. By the afternoon of May 21st, Lee knew that the entire Union Army was on the move. Burnside's 9th Corps marched south, but they encountered Ewell's Corps. Not wanting to bring on a general engagement while the army was spread out, and unsure about the strength of the enemy in his front, Burnside countermarched back toward Spotsylvania Courthouse. Lee instructed Richard Anderson, temporarily commanding James Longstreet's corps, to march at 7 p.m. down the Telegraph Road with Ewell's Corps in front on their way to North Anna. A.P. Hill's corps left at 10 p.m. and swung farther to the west. The exhausted troops traveled through the night in an attempt to get beyond Grant's reach and to buy time for Lee to judge Grant's true intentions. By 8 a.m. on the morning of May 22nd, Lee crossed the North Anna. He had won the race. Grant and the Army of the Potomac commander George Meade discussed their next steps in the campaign. Grant had 2 options. He could swing to the east or west and force Lee to give up his defensive positions south of the river, or he could head straight for Lee. Meade, tired of the bloodshed, wanted to try the flanking maneuver, but Grant chose to adhere to his original plan that stated, "Lee's army will be your objective point. Wherever Lee goes, you will go." By the end of the day on May 22nd, the entire Union Army was on their way to the North Anna. Problems arose throughout Grant and Meade's army as they marched south. The maps that the corps commanders used were substandard, not including important locations, and the locations that were on the maps were in the wrong places. Grant passed down the orders for the army to begin marching toward Lee at 5 a.m. The early morning didn't relieve the hot summer heat. Warren and his 5th Corps ran into problems when he was ordered to cross at Jericho Bridge. He didn't see a Jericho Bridge on his map, but there was a Jericho Mills. He would find out that there was instead a ford at Jericho Mills. Warren and his aides enlisted the help of an elderly African-American man to find the ford, but he confessed that he hadn't been to it in about 50 years. By the evening of May 23rd, Grant's forces were closing in on Lee. Lee himself hadn't fortified his position yet because he feared that Grant may swing to the west or east to flank him out of his position. But the Confederate general would soon get confirmation that Grant was heading straight for him. The bloodshed over the past couple of weeks had yet to dampen the spirits of the Confederate rank and file. One soldier wrote, "I believe this campaign to be the decisive one, and know we are going to whip the detestable enemy." Another wrote, "If Grant still desires to fight, he can be accommodated, and I think with the same results as before." At the North Anna, Lee placed Anderson's corps in the center, Hill's corps on the left, and Ewell's corps on the right. Anderson, as he crossed the Chesterfield Bridge, placed John Hennigan's brigade of South Carolinians at a redoubt that guarded the bridge, then marched the rest of the corps across. Warren's 5th Corps was already crossing at the ford at Jericho Mills. Lee enlisted the help of Jedediah Hotchkiss, Stonewall Jackson's mapmaker for the Shenandoah Valley campaign, to help position his army to best take advantage of the ground on the south side of the river. Hotchkiss suggested not fortifying the location because the ground on the north side of the river was higher, which would subject the men to horrible artillery fire if they entrenched. Hancock and the Second Corps approached the redoubt guarded by the South Carolinians. 100-yard open field was in front of the fortification, which the Southerners knew would allow them to rain lead into the advancing troops when the attacks began. A soldier in Hennigan's brigade recalled the scene years later. Here we hoped the enemy would attack us. On the south side of this river, on the road leading to Hanover Station, good heavy works had been completed, while a fort of inferior proportions on the north side was intended to protect the bridge across the river from raiding parties of the enemy. To our surprise, when the part of our army that was designed to cross the river at this point had crossed over, the 3rd Regiment, James Battalion, and the 7th Regiment were left behind about this fort. We had no idea that anything serious was intended, but after a while it leaked out that General Lee needed some time to complete a line of works from one point of the river to another on the same stream, on the south side, and that it would be intended that the bare handful of men with us were intended to hold the approach to the bridge in face of the tens of thousands of Grant's army in our front. Trying to realize the task assigned us, positions were assigned the different forces with us. It was seen that the 7th Regiment, which stretched to the left of the fort, could not occupy, even by a thin line, the territory near them. We were promised the cooperation of artillery just on the other side of the river. Hancock positioned 12 artillery batteries to assist his infantry in destroying the lone Confederate brigade. Brigadier General David Birney's division was chosen to attack the redoubt. Birney's 3,000 men from Thomas Egan, Byron Pierce, and William Brewster's brigades readied themselves for the assault. Egan's troops were split, with part of them attacking down the Telegraph Road, while the others were on the extreme left flank. A mixture of Pierce and Brewster's men occupied the right, with the rest of Brewster's brigade in reserve. When the 12 batteries opened fire on the South Carolinians, it shook the ground, making the Southerners dive for cover, and also neutralized a lot of the Confederate artillery on the south side of the river. Birney attacked at 6:30 p.m. The Confederate skirmishers out front fired only a few shots before being thrown back by the approaching Federals. A member of the 124th New York remembered, "One of the most savage fires of shell and bullets I have ever experienced, but the men only rushed on all the faster. We were only a few moments crossing the flats, but left strewn along our route nearly 1/5 of the charging line." The 7th, South Carolina, broke first, with some running for the bridge and others running into the river to escape the Union bullets. With their flank gone, the rest of Hennigan's men headed for the rear. A soldier in the brigade remembered, "It was manifest now that the enemy would soon be in our rear, and as the sun was sinking to rest in the west, we made a bold dash to cross the river in our rear, bringing down upon us the enemy's artillery fire of shot and shell as well as musketry. It looked hard to tell which way across the river was best, whether by way of the bridge or to wade across. It was said our lieutenant colonel, who was on foot when reaching the opposite bank and finding his boots full of water, said to a soldier, 'Tom, give me your hand.' 'No, no, Major,' was the reply. 'This is no time for giving hands.' The ascent of the long hill on the south side was made under heavy fire of the enemy. When at its height, a stuttering soldier proposed to a comrade to lay down and let him get behind him. Of course, the proposition was declined without thanks. When we reformed at the top of the hill, there was quite a fund of jokes told. Amongst others, the one last stated, Tom Paysinger, said, 'Nelson, if I had been there, I would have killed myself laughing,' whereupon the stutterer said, 'Tom Paysinger, I saw a heap of men down there, but not one that laughed.' War has its humorous as well as its serious side, and many a joke was cracked in battle, or if not mentioned then, the joke was told soon afterwards. It is recalled just here that in this battle an officer, who had escaped being wounded up to that time, was painfully wounded. When being borne on the way to the rear on a stretcher, he was heard to exclaim, 'Oh, that I had been a good man! Oh, that I had listened to my mother!' When he returned to the army, many a laugh was had at his expense when these expressions would be reported. But the officer got even with one of his tormentors, who was one of the bearers of the litter upon which the officer was borne away, for while this young man was at his best and imitating the words and tone of the wounded man, he was suddenly arrested by the words, 'Yes, I remember when a shell burst pretty close, you forgot me, and dropped your into the litter.' The laugh was turned. All this, however, was in perfect good humor. With Hennigan's brigade now pushed over the river, Hancock's 2nd Corps troops began moving across. Now, Lee would need to contend with 2 Union corps across the North Anna, Hancock, and Warren on the far left. As Winfield Scott Hancock and his 2nd Corps was pushing away Hennigan's brigade at the Chesterfield Bridge, Governor K. Warren's 5th Corps was battling with Cadmus Wilcox's division of A.P. Hill's Corps upriver. Warren, unlike his earlier actions at the Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse, took the initiative and pushed his men across the river at Jericho Mills. It wasn't a deep river, being about 150 feet wide and 4 feet deep, but the banks were high, so he immediately got his engineers constructing a bridge, but he couldn't wait for them to finish. He needed to get across the river. Charles Griffin's division got across first, establishing a beachhead on the other side of the river, and that allowed the other divisions in Warren's corps to cross. Soon the majority of the corps was across. Approaching their position was the division of Cadmus Wilcox. Rooney Lee, Robert E. Lee's son, and a cavalry division commander notified Wilcox that it was just cavalry in his front and that it would be easy to throw them back. Wilcox advanced toward the river, expecting to encounter some dismounted cavalry, but ran into most of Warren's corps. Griffin's division and part of Samuel Crawford's were in position to throw back an enemy attack, but Lysander Cutler's division had just crossed the river when the attack was commencing. Wilcox positioned William Pegram's artillery on the Confederate right to hold Crawford's men in place while he attacked them in front. The artillery battered the blue troops, preventing their movement, and many shells were fired closer to the river to prevent reinforcements from coming up. When Wilcox's men hit the Union line, it overlapped Warren's flank. The murderous fire from Joseph Brown's South Carolinians and Edward Thomas's Georgians sent the Iron Brigade to the rear, except for the tenacious 6th Wisconsin, who remained at the front. Cutler's other brigades, of J. William Hoffman and Edward Bragg, came up to stem the tide of the approaching rebels, but Wilcox's brigade leveled their rifled muskets and threw disastrous volleys into their ranks, sending Bragg's troops into a retreat just like the Iron Brigade. Warren's corps was under serious threat of being driven back toward the river. However, Wilcox's success would also lead to his failure. Like with any successful attack, cohesion began to break down. Thomas continued forward, but the 6th Wisconsin fired into his flank. This unexpected volley stunned Thomas's rightmost regiments, sending them to the rear, leaving Thomas with only 2 regiments, the 14th and 45th Georgia, to continue the assault. The success also produced a gap between James Lane's North Carolinians and Joseph Brown's South Carolinians. The gap was so large that Lane believed Brown had fallen back. It was only when Wilcox assured him that their comrades were indeed still fighting that Lane continued the attack. Despite the problems, Brown pushed back the 6th Wisconsin and part of Jacob Schweitzer's brigade, but Warren was quickly rushing reinforcements to the scene. Joseph Bartlett's brigade surged forward, which knocked back Brown's brigade and what was left of Thomas's Georgians. Hoffman's brigade saw an opportunity with Alfred Scales' brigade left alone on the flank. Hoffman charged forward, driving Scales away and securing the beachhead for the Union. The battle in that sector was over, and Warren was able to avoid disaster and act quickly to seal the breakthrough. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Wilcox had nearly routed an entire corps with a single division. Robert E. Lee was mad. He came up to A.P. Hill and asked, "General Hill, why did you let those people cross here? Why didn't you throw your whole force on them and drive them back as Jackson would have done?" Hill remained silent during the reprimand. Wilcox and Henry Heath pulled their divisions back to a strong line that Lee assembled, despite a salient being present. The engineer in Lee and the suggestions by his subordinates helped to create a great defensive line with interior lines and a great reserve. Hill's corps stretched from the North Anna to the Little River on the Confederate left. Richard Anderson's corps occupied the center, with George Pickett and John Breckinridge's divisions in reserve. Richard Ewell's corps was on the left. His front and flank was protected by a swampy area. With Grant's troops coming across the river, Lee's defensive line denied the Union commander interior lines. If Grant wanted to reinforce either flank or need to seal a breakthrough, his men would have to cross the North Anna 2 times. Night came and the morning brought orders for more attacks. Ambrose Burnside was to move part of his 9th Corps across the North Anna at Ox Ford and the other half at Quarles Mill. On the morning of May 24th, 2 regiments from Orlando Wilcox's division approached the river and made it to an island in the middle of the waterway. Developments on the eastern end of the battlefield caused Burnside to halt his men and ordered them not to continue crossing. Part of Crittenden's division made it across at Quarles Mill with the help of Crawford's division from Warren's 5th Corps. James Ledley's brigade forded the river at 2 p.m., raising their weapons, cartridge boxes, and cap boxes over their heads. They moved out from the beachhead toward the Confederate entrenchments. The brigade quickly pushed back the rebel skirmish line. Ledlie asked his division commander, Thomas Crittenden, for more troops, but he had none to spare and none on hand to quickly support him, so he ordered Ledlie to halt and not attack. Ledlie, as one historian said, was filled with liquor and ambition and decided to attack anyway. The men charged the Confederate line and immediately came under a withering hail of musketry and artillery shells. The front line fell back, and the second line surged forward, only to be met with the same fate. Some of the rebels came out of their breastworks to chase after the Federals and cleared their front of the enemy. Ledlie lost 450 men, or a third of his brigade, in the futile attack. While Ledlie's men attacked, Warren moved his corps to Knoll Station on the Virginia Central Railroad, and Horatio Wright's corps took the place of Warren's men across from Jericho Mills. Hancock was moving his divisions and brigades across the Chesterfield Bridge, attempting to shore up his lines. Hancock didn't know exactly where Robert E. Lee's lines were, so he ordered Division Commander Francis Barlow to probe south along the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. Barlow chose Thomas Smith and his brigade to reconnoiter the front, and as they pressed south, they came into contact with Confederate skirmishers. They knew the main line wouldn't be far away and swept the skirmishers aside and came into contact with Parr Charles Field and Robert Rhodes's divisions. Smith bolstered his line with other troops from the brigade, but knew he couldn't push the enemy from their position. Later, Barlow sent John Brooks' brigade to stabilize Smith's right flank, but realized the heavily entrenched rebels were too much for his two brigades and called off any attack. By that evening, Grant knew he needed to change strategy. He ordered Warren to test the Confederate line in his front, and after some probing, Warren reported that, "I feel satisfied that I should have great difficulty at best in whipping the enemy in my front." Grant and Meade held a council of war to decide what to do next. Some officers suggested moving to the east, keeping in constant communication with Washington and their supply base. Others thought they should move to Lee's left and push on from Richmond from the northwest. Grant decided on that strategy, but the next day reversed his decision. They would move east and swing around Lee's right flank. The Battle of North Anna was over. The Union lost 3,986 total, 591 killed, 2,734 wounded, and 661 captured or missing. The Confederacy lost 1,552 total, 124 killed, 704 wounded, and 724 missing or captured. It wasn't the deadliest battle of the Overland Campaign, but demonstrated Robert E. Lee's tactical and strategic skills and Ulysses S. Grant's determination to get Lee away from their entrenched areas and out into the open.